Welcome to this video on the two knights variation, which is characterized by the moves e4, c6, knight f3, d5 and knight c3. Now first of all, there is another move order to get to the exact same position, and that would be the moves e4, c6, knight c3 first, and on d5 knight f3. Now this is just a transposition to the other line. It's exactly the same two knights variation. Now, before we jump into the theory behind the two knights variation, there is one more thing which I wanted to mention, and that is after the moves e4, c6, knight f3, d5, white has the move d3. Now, I should have covered it in the first part of this video series, whenever I looked at the side steps available for white against the Caro-Kann, but I didn't do so, because after the moves d takes e4, d takes e4, we can take on d1 with the queen, and we are forcing white to take back with his own king and achieving this endgame, which at first sight looks kind of ridiculous from the white's point of view. But in the last few months, actually, when I played blitz games online, I faced this line quite frequently. Surprisingly, this was played by quite strong players. And when I checked out the theory behind this option for white, I realized that there are many strong grandmasters who are opting for this setup with white in the last couple of months, mostly in online blitz games, so it's not the most testing line, but it's way more tricky than I thought it is. Now, there might be some setups which are not good for black to achieve equality. Reason is, white has a fairly simple plan, and that is to play a4, a5, put the knight on c4 and getting out the bishop to e3, and with that put lots of pressure on black's position on the queen side. On the other hand, obviously black should be alright, there is nothing to be afraid of, and I learned that the best setup here is to play the move knight f6, immediately putting pressure on the pawn on e4. Also, we are not afraid of the move e5, that's an important bit. On e5 we can always jump to d5 and with that achieve a comfortable position. More often than not, keep in mind that g6, bishop g7 gonna be a good way to develop, putting immediately pressure on the e5 pawn. If white cannot really go e5, that means that on the move knight f6 he has to choose a way to defend the pawn on e4, and actually there are quite a few different ways to achieve that. Let's go through them. If white plays the move knight bd2, here the best idea for black is to putting even more pressure on the e4 pawn, and that can be achieved by the move knight bd7 followed by knight c5. Here white can try quite a few different things. In one high-profile game, knight e1 was played, but here we can just play knight g4, a strong move and asking some questions due to the fact that white's development is quite weird. Now the f2 pawn is hanging, and on knight d3 we can put more pressure on that pawn indirectly by attacking the d3 knight, which defends the f2 pawn, and starting to exchange off pieces, solving all of our problems. And if white opts for king e2, actually we have a very comfortable way of continuing our development, and that is to play b6 with the threat of bishop a6 check, and once again black has no problem whatsoever. Instead of knight e1, white could try some other options. White can play the usual a4, but here we are in time to play knight c5, and white does not have any good ways to deal with the threat of knight e4. White has to push through with e5, and we got ourselves nice outpost on d5 for the knight. We can follow it up with the already mentioned very normal and natural development with g6 and bishop g7. For example, this position would be perfectly fine for us. We have an easy way to play. We can castle and we can get the bishop from c8 out to either g4 or e6 or even f5, whichever we prefer, putting the rooks towards the middle. Another way what white could try after the move knight bd2, knight bd7 is to play the move bishop c4, and the idea would be to meet knight c5 with rook e1. But here, once again, we have a comfortable position, and the move b5 seems like a good option for us. It's not necessary or mandatory to play this move, but actually it's a nice way to gain some space on the queen side, and once the bishop retreats, once again g6 is the way to go to finish up development. Now whenever we play a move like b5, it's important to note that it weakens up some of the squares around the queen side, and we have to be quite careful about it. We don't want to hit by a4, but here it's not a question thanks to the knight controlling that square. And if white plays c4, actually we have an easy way keeping everything under control, and that is to play the move a6. and black is just fine. There is nothing to be worried about. Now let's just jump back to the starting position here. After knight f6, we looked at the move knight bd2, which after we can put more pressure on the e4 pawn with knight bd7 followed by knight c5. White can try the funky looking knight fd2, and one of the ideas is that the e4 pawn are gonna be way more stable for white because he will have the option to play f3. Though there is a drawback to that move as well, and that is, obviously it's not developing white's pieces, and that means that black has more time to do whatever he wants. And we should use this time to gain space on the king side, and the move h5 is something which I like quite a lot. And on f3, we can continue this course of action with the move h4. Now, the computer suggestion is to play the move g5, which I like quite a lot as well. But the move h4, which was played in a high-profile game between Nepomniachtchi and Tomaszewski, is a good move as well. Now on a4, once again our standard development gonna be with the move g6, and on a5, Tomaszewski played the move bishop h6, and I believe black has solved all of his problems. And actually it's interesting to see how the game continued from here on. Let's just check out a few more moves, because after knight c3, bishop e6, knight c4, bishop takes c1, rook takes c1. Actually, black went on to lose this game in a mere 10 moves, but I do believe that if black has taken on c4 and played knight bd7, follow it up with the very logical knight e5, hitting the bishop on c4, and on bishop b3, playing the move g5, which is an important idea to control the f4 square, and with that making the e5 knight a monster, black could have achieved a very nice position. Objectively speaking, still everything is around equal, but practically speaking I would take black here, and it's a position where we can even think about taking over the initiative and playing for the advantage. Now let's just jump back, and there is one more move to take a look at, and that is what happens if white chooses to play the move knight c3. This move is very logical, though it has the drawback that the knight might not be the best placed on c3. Obviously the pawn on c6 makes a good job controlling the knight, and also whenever the knight lands on c3 we can see that the f3 knight is a bit more exposed, hence the move bishop g4 looks like the strongest for us. And there is a very important idea to finish up this line with, and that is on bishop e2 we really should take on f3. The reason is that instead if we play the very logical knight bd7, actually white can play the move knight e1, and white gonna be slightly better. After this move, probably the bishop's gonna be exchanged, and white will be ready to play f3, play knight e3, play a4, a5, play bishop e3, and with all those natural moves, he's gonna have an easy development and easy way to put some pressure on us, and it's not gonna be that easy to find a sensible setup for black. Hence, the better thing to do here after bishop e2 is just to give up the pair of bishop with bishop f3 right away, but in exchange for that pair of bishop, actually we are getting an easy development. Also, white's pieces are a little bit tangled up. The king on d1 is bad. The bishop on f3 might look okay, but actually it's not perfect. The pawn belongs to f3, and the bishop gonna go back to e2 sooner or later, so white lost quite a few tempis there as well. And also we are talking about a closed position, so having the pair of bishop is not something which white can utilize in this position. One way this game might continue is that maybe white gonna play bishop e2 immediately, and after e6, a4, bishop d6, a5, king e7, f3 seems like a sensible way to play with both sides. Here a last neat idea which might be useful to remember, that the move b5 here looks quite strong. The idea behind this move is simply just to gain space on the queen side and also keeping everything closed. If white chooses to take on b6 with en passant, actually turns out that black is the one who is going to gain control over the open a file, so probably white is not going to do that. But if white does not do en passant in this position, obviously he cannot do it later on, hence the position is still gonna remain closed, but black is the one who is getting a bit more space over there, and once again we are having a comfortable position. Now we are ready to go back to the very beginning and actually take a look at the so-called two knights variation, which is coming to life after these moves up on the board. Now here my recommendation gonna be to take on e4, and on knight e4 play the move knight f6 right away. I'm not only recommending knight f6 because it's a solid and good choice, but also because it fits in within our repertoire perfectly, especially if we think about the Korchnoi variation, which is my recommendation in part 1 of this video series against the classical mainline. We could get the exact same pawn structure if white chooses to take on f6 in this position, and we're gonna already be familiar with the plans and ideas available there. Now in this position actually white has 3 different moves, one being knight takes f6. Statistically speaking, that's white's most frequent choice, so there is a good chance we're gonna meet that move over the board in most of our games. White can try the move knight g3, it's not gonna be dangerous, it's not such a good move in this position, and also there is the funky looking queen e2. And actually that's considered to be the most dangerous move, and I treat it as the main line against our knight f6 setup within the 2 knights variation, and we're gonna take a look at that move in a separate video. But let's take a look at the other choices what white has here. So first of all, there is the move knight g3, which I mentioned, and it's not that great. There are multiple options available for us, but what I like the most is to develop once again with the move g6, and especially against the knight on g3, that's very logical, because the move g6 controls that knight, takes away the potential h5 and f5 squares. Now our plan gonna be pretty simple. We want to develop with bishop g7, castle, and whenever white plays d4, sooner or later we want to play the move c5 to blow up the center and fight for space. So for example, on the move d4, we follow up with bishop g7, and let's take a look at bishop e2. Here, that's a good time to go c5. Now we could just castle and play c5 later on, but c5 is stronger as long as white have not yet castled. Reason is that if white takes on c5, we can take on d1, and white has to make a weird choice. Either take back on d1 with the king, which is not perfect obviously, or he can take back with the bishop, but that's also not ideal either because the bishop on d1 is just misplaced. And we're gonna get back our pawn on c5. After knight bd7, bishop e3 could be a try for white to hang on to the pawn on c5, but after knight d5, there are just too many threats along the way. Bishop b2 is threatening, knight e3 followed by knight c5 is also an idea, and the natural move bishop d4 can be met by e5, and actually black is already better. We're gonna get back our pawn with some interests as well. White could play the move c3 after bishop g7. Seems like a logical choice, but here after castle, bishop d3, once again we are in time to break up the center with c5. We are not afraid of d takes c5, knight bd7, b4, and by the way that would be the only way to prove that white really has something. But here we're just gonna get such a nice play for the sacrificed pawn with the usual breakup of white's queen side with the move a5. Bishop b2 can be a way to try to keep everything under control, but we can follow up with knight d5. Now c3 is hanging, queen d2, exchanging the pawns on b4, taking on b2, and playing knight f4. Everything comes with a tempi, and white's position is on the blink of a collapse. d3 and g2 are hanging, and hard to see any good ways for white to keep his position intact. If we jump back to the beginning, here maybe the most logical move is to develop with bishop c4, but once again, before white gets the chance to castle, we just break up the center with the move c5. Once again, we have solved all of our problems. If d takes c5, we exchange the queens, forcing the white king to d1, and we will go after the pawn on c5, and there is no good way for white to keep that protected. If bishop e3, then now we don't have knight d5 as we had when the bishop was on e2, but we do have knight g4, and it's a pretty strong one. Black once again is better, b2 is hanging, knight e3 followed by knight c5 is a threat, and once again we're gonna get back our pawn with some interests. We have very good prospects in the endgame. White could choose to play rook e1 instead of the move bishop e3 in this position, but that's really not dangerous because we are in time to grab back our pawn on c5 with knight takes c5, and on bishop e3 we do have multiple moves. Probably knight e6 is the best, and on c3 knight g4 is a pretty good follow-up. Note that the knight on e6 actually does a pretty good job taking away lots of squares from that e3 bishop, and if we can hunt down that bishop, black will be very happy to play the endgame with his pair of bishop, and once again he would have pretty good prospects towards the endgame. Now, one different direction to take a note of is that on c5, white could castle first instead of taking on c5 himself. But in this case, once again, black just gonna have such an easy play. We're gonna grab the pawn on d4, and with that, we manage to blow up white's center. And here, after castle, we do not have anything to worry about. We can follow it up with bishop d7, knight c6. That would be one way to go. Or bishop g4, knight bd7 could be another way to go. For example, on b3, bishop g4 seems like a strong move, and white is a little bit uncomfortable. The move f3 is not a move that he really wants to do, though that seems the most logical. Here we can even just drop back the bishop, and that's an interesting idea to keep in mind, that the move f3 can be counterproductive for white many times, weakening up the e3 square and weakening up the g1 a7 diagonal. And for example here, if white continues with bishop b2, which probably was his plan after the move b3, black can take over the initiative with the moves e5, now the d4 knight is kicked out, b5, c4 bishop is hanging, queen b6 check, king h1 is the only sensible move, and knight c6, and suddenly out of the blue, black finished up his development, gained lots of space, has the bigger center, and has a natural play along the open file for his rooks, and therefore black is already better. Now jumping back to the very beginning. So, after the move knight f6, as mentioned, knight g3 is not a great move. So, just to recap, on knight g3, g6 is the key move to remember, taking away the space from that knight, and just remember to blow up the center whenever white plays d4, c5 should be our idea and should be the way to go. White can play in a different way, and that is to take on f6. And here we take back with the e-pawn, and that's what I mentioned when I said that this position might resemble to the Korchnoi variation, which is in our repertoire against the classical mainline. Black has exactly the same pawn structure on the king side. And honestly speaking, this might be even an improved version, because in the Korchnoi variation, actually white can force black to play the move h7, h5, which might not be the best. I mean, we can get away with it, we already looked at those ideas and lines in the first part of this video series, but still, without h5, black position should be even more comfortable. Now, white doesn't have too many choices. Either he just develops normally and castles to the short side, or there is one distinct choice for him, and that is to play bishop c4 first, and on our normal development, which is to put the bishop to d6, play quickly queen e2 check. Now, if white wants to play that way, he really has to play in this move order, otherwise he will not get this option. Now, if black wants to keep things a bit more exciting, maybe we could play bishop e7, though it's gonna be a loss of a tempi. I'm not sure if that's objectively such a great choice, but if we are in a must-win situation, maybe that could be a move to consider. But once again, it's losing a tempi, because sooner or later, after castling, probably we have to drop back the bishop to d6, and obviously that's not the best to play. The main move here on queen e2 check is queen e7, and actually that solves all of our problems, though it's gonna be a bit boring, to be honest. It's not gonna be the most exciting of games. On queen e7, we just take back with the king, and on d4, we play bishop e6. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if there is an exchange of bishops on e6, we are happy to take back with the f-pawn. After bishop e3, knight d7, long castle, and knight b6, even though the position objectively speaking is equal, actually this is a position where black can think about gaining the upper hand, because we have such an easy play. Putting the king on f7 seems like a natural choice, just to go ahead and get out of the open e-file. And after that, g5, h5, expanding on the king side, gonna be so natural for black and such an easy play, while white doesn't really have any targets. So it's an easier game for black, and once again, we can even play such a game for a win. Objectively speaking, I think it's better for white not to take on e6, because with that he would solve our tiny problem with the pawn structure, but rather retreat with the bishop to d3. And here, we can play the move knight a6. This is something that we have seen already, that we are not afraid of bishop takes a6, because in these scenarios the pair of bishops just gonna outweigh the problems what we might have with our pawn structure. White doesn't have any good ways to put pressure on our isolated pawns on the a file or on the c file, but we do have the pair of bishop which gonna be pretty strong, and also we do have some open files to operate on. So in this position after knight a6, white is more likely to stop the threat of knight b4 with the move c3, but after the logical follow-ups with rook hd8, castle and knight c7, actually this position is very solid for black. King f8 is coming, a5 is coming, and black can play freely either on the king side or on the queen side, pushing his pawns up. Now the trick is here that even though we have a slightly worse pawn structure, white has the problem that he cannot really create anything out of his majority on the queen side, because whenever he starts to push his pawns on the queen side, let's say with c4 at one moment, immediately his pawns gonna start to weaken up and there's gonna be a certain pressure against those pawns. Now jumping back to this position, after the queen exchange with queen e7, king e7, instead of d4, maybe white can try to castle immediately, and in this case on bishop e6, he could play the move rook e1. Once again, white does not want to take on e6 because after f takes e6, black will have a very healthy position. But here as well, I don't think that we have any problem at all. King d7, getting out of the pin, is a logical way to continue. Now the c4 bishop is under attack, and also he doesn't want to take on e6, so retreating to e2 seems to be logical. And here, one of the directions where we can go and was played by some strong grandmasters is to play the move a5, and it's perfectly fine. Though the engine suggestion is also pretty good, to play the move c5, gaining more space in the center, and the idea is that if white does not play d4 immediately, we just go knight c6 ourselves, and white might not have any chance at all to play that move. So probably d4 is the best, and here we can play the move knight c6 once again. And on bishop e3, we are in time to exchange few pieces in the center and play rook hd8, and the king can appear on e7 or c7 depending on our choice. Once again, we do have a tiny bit worse pawn structure due to the fact that our f pawns are doubled, but there is no way for white to utilize that fact, and he cannot really push his pawns on the queen side without weakening them up. And with that we have solved all of our problems in the opening. Now let's just jump back in, and after e takes f6, usually white plays the move d4, and on bishop d6, white do have a choice, but those choices are pretty similar in a sense. The bishop can go out to e2, d3 or c4, and white can castle short side. Pretty much that's what he can do. There is one independent try, and that is to play the move bishop e3, but after castle queen d2, rook e8, long castle, turns out that white is already in kind of a trouble. Now it might be surprising at first, but if we think about it, black has a very healthy pawn structure in front of the king, which means that white will have a very hard time creating any attack. On the other hand, black will have a very easy time to create his own play. I just illustrate that. We can play the move bishop e6. Now a2 is hanging, so king b1 seems to be logical. Knight a6 is a very nice move to follow it up. And now knight b4 is the idea. If c4 was played, then knight can jump to b4, and surprisingly, white is in real trouble already. b5 might be one idea, and if white plays something like a3, actually it's very easy to get checkmated in the upcoming moves. Bishop f5 check, on king c1, actually knight a2 would be a nice way to finish the game, and on king a1, we can play the fancy move b5. The idea is that after a takes b4, a5, due to the fact that we just played b5 one move earlier, white cannot push through. And if white cannot push through, actually the opening up the a5 gonna be very unpleasant for him. A takes b4 is threatening with a checkmate, so bishop d3 is the move which keeps white's hopes alive, but after taking on b4 with a check, and on king b1, even giving up the f5 bishop with b takes c4, actually turns out that white is dead lost. Bishop f5, queen a5, and white is getting checkmated. Now still there might be some precision needed. As always, we have to be careful, and for example on bishop h7, the best to avoid all complications and not to give white a chance to improve his position with some checks. If we take back on h7 with king, then queen c2 for example could be an option, but simply king f8 gonna be winning. King c1, we just give a check. The bishop can dance back to b1, but here after rook a2, c3 is a threat, and on queen c2 we do have b3. the final combination gonna be queen c3, rook b2, and on queen b2, bishop a3. White is losing. There would be some other ways with black as well to win this game. This one was just to illustrate how big problems there can be if white does not pay attention. So once again, after knight a6, we could have seen that if white plays c4, then knight b4 followed by bishop f5 is just killer. And if a3, then we can bring the knight to c7, follow it up with b5 and knight d5, and after that maybe even b4, or attack is coming very quickly. On c4, once again, we do have bishop f5 check, and on bishop d3, exchanging the bishops and playing b5. It's a very typical motif, not only opening up the position against the white's king on b1, but also creating an outpost for ourselves on d5 once the c4 pawn gonna be removed, and the knight just gonna be amazing there once it arrives. Black has a very healthy position, very easy to play, and black is definitely better. Now jumping back to this position, so here white's choices are pretty much to put the bishop to somewhere along the f1 a6 diagonal, and after that castle. I believe that bishop d3 might be the best move, and that's what I choose for the main line. Now bishop c4 does not seem to be too logical to my mind. The bishop doesn't do anything on c4 rather than just stopping the white pawn on c2 from getting to c4 itself. We're gonna castle, and on castle we can play the move rook e8, that's gonna be always good. But I would say that if the white bishop is not going to e2 and we can pin the opponent with bishop g4, then probably that's a good choice to do so. The game might continue with such moves like h3, bishop h5, rook e1, knight d7, the typical moves, and once again I would like to point out these are type of moves which we could make in the Korchnoi variation as well. c3, and after rook e8, exchanging few pair of pieces, black is ready to transfer the knight to f8, play rook d8, and maybe even think about the move c5, or just bringing the knight to either e6 or g6 at a good moment and improving his position. And once again, we solved all of our problems. In this position, white could start the whole thing with bishop e2, and after castle, probably in this situation I would say that maybe playing rook e8 is a bit more logical than playing bishop g4. So probably here I would choose rook e8 rather, and on rook e1, once again continuing the game with the usual moves, knight d7, and on c4, knight f8 is the ideal setup for us. Now we are ready to play bishop f5 or bishop e6 or maybe bishop g4 on the next move, and on queen b3 actually just wanted to show some possibilities to see how we can play such a position. For example, there is this nice pawn sacrificial idea, b5. If white takes on b5, which is really the only question, then we take back, and on bishop b5, rook e1, knight e1, queen a5 seems to be very dangerous. Objectively speaking, this is very messy and white should be alright with some precise play, but now the e1 knight is hanging already, and rook b8 is coming with some threats along the b5 bishop, and actually white has to be very careful not to lose a piece here. Another move what we can do after queen b3 is actually to play the move bishop f5 and simply follow it up with queen d7 or queen c7. Now the trick is here that queen b7 would be a bad move. Here after rook b8, turns out that white cannot take on a7, because after bishop b4, bishop d2, we just play rook e7. It's a smart intermediate move. We could have done without that move as well, but it's better to include that. And once the queen retreats, we take on d2, and white takes back, and we take on b2. Now the knight is hanging on d2, queen d4 is coming, and white's position is kind of falling apart. White has to be very careful once again not to lose material right away. White could choose to take on c6 in this position, but it's not gonna be any better. Problem here is that after the move bishop e4, the queen is hanging, and also we have the threat to take on f3, and utilizing the fact that the e2 bishop gonna be pinned towards the e-bar rook. So for example, after d5, we take on f3, g takes f3, and one last neat idea is that after rook b6, kicking out the queen from c6, queen a4, f5, surprisingly that rook from a8 through b8, b6 gonna arrive to g6, and black surprisingly is already winning. White is getting checkmated. Other than that, a very normal move could be to play simply rook b8 if we don't want to calculate, and that's good enough as well. And on bishop e3 we can play bishop e6. Now b5 is the idea, and if queen a4, then we can just simply go a6, protecting all of our pawns, and the usual moves can be considered here: queen c7, queen d7, knight g6, maybe starting to press the pawns up on the king side with h6, f5, g5. It's also a possibility. b5 break is always up in the air, so actually black has surprisingly many options. Coming back to the starting position after bishop d6, as I mentioned, I think bishop d3 is the best move, and after castle, we can either go rook e8, but once again, if we can pin the f3 knight with bishop g4, I would just go for this direction, and on h3 drop back the bishop to h5. Now white doesn't want to play g4, and if white does not play g4, then the bishop on h5 is very annoying. It's not that easy to get rid of the pressure along that diagonal for white. And after rook e1, we do have our usual setup with knight d7, and on c4, bringing the rook to e8. And there was one correspondence game with rook e8, queen e8, bishop e3, rook d8, logical moves for both white and black. And after king f1, which looks kind of strange, but white doesn't really have any good moves to improve his position anyway, knight f8, bishop f5 was played. And here comes a move which at first was surprising to me, but actually I started to appreciate the plan later on, and that is that black played the move g6. First I thought that it looks kind of risky because this bishop on h5 is so out of play, and in the game bishop g4 was played. Why not bishop d3, trying to keep that bishop on h5 on the rim of the board, already threatening to play g4, and black's plan should not be just to give up the bishop on f3. But it turns out that after the move f5, black is better, black is taking over the initiative. There is nothing that white can do with this bishop, and it's not like white can even just bring away his pieces and say that the bishop is misplaced there, because there is just no way to get out of that pin. White can go back with the bishop to e2, but even then the bishop on h5, worst case scenario, gonna be exchanged down for the bishop on e2, which is gonna wait out till the knight moves out from f3. And here in this position white already has to be careful, because f4 might be up in the air, the knight might just come to e6, and black has a very comfortable position. No wonder in that correspondence game, once again, white retreated to g4, but here after taking on g4, putting pressure on that guy immediately, and on g5, bishop e7 was played, and black has actually solved all of his problems already. Takes, queen c2 was played in the game, and besides other things, I think queen g4 could have been a good way to activate black's position, follow it up with knight e6, and it's kind of visible that we don't have any problems, and actually we are ready to put pressure on the d4 pawn, and also the white king can be a tiny bit vulnerable due to the fact that white is missing the h pawn. Within the two knights variation there is only one thing left, and that is what happens if white plays the move queen e2 instead of taking on f6, but that's something which we're gonna cover in the upcoming video.